Muy bien, iniciamos la sesión de la mañana con esta sesión virtual denominada Justicia climática en el derecho a la vivienda y el hábitat, que es auspiciada por Hábitat para la Humanidad, la cual estará a cargo de Balakrishnan Rayagopal, relator especial sobre el derecho a una vivienda adecuada para las Naciones Unidas, quien nos acompaña de manera virtual. Adelante, señor, con su presentación.
Distinguished leaders of the government of Colombia and of the city of Bogota, representatives of Habitat for Humanity, representatives of civil society organizations, and other participants. I'm honored to present this keynote address today at this important LAC Housing Forum on the challenges posed by the climate and social crisis to the realization of the right to adequate housing. I regret that I'm not able to join in person due to health reasons, but hope to do so in the future. In this talk, I will primarily draw upon my recent report to the UN Human Rights Council titled Towards a Just Transformation, the Climate Crisis and the Right to Housing. With each passing year, the damaging impacts of climate change are becoming more and more obvious. In 2022, we bore witness to numerous climate-induced disasters across the world that destroyed completely people's homes, rendered them uninhabitable, or forced people to evacuate, unable to protect their homes and unsure that they would have a safe place to return to. 2023 has been even worse. Unprecedented heat waves that have not been seen in recorded human history, floods of epic proportions, and ocean temperatures that are historic, and much more in Asia, Middle East, North Africa, North America, Europe. And as a recent report from the World Meteorological Organization notes, an acute rise in extreme weather and climate shocks in Latin America and the Caribbean. At this challenging hour, the climate resilience of housing, capacity of states to provide safe shelter during times of climate disasters, and to ensure support is available to rebuild are all critical for ensuring populations can continue to enjoy the bare minimum required by the right to adequate housing. On the other hand, we now know that housing itself is a significant contributor to climate change. The housing deficit experienced in many countries around the world seems to require many more housing units to be built, and climate change-induced migration of people seems to require more housing in newer locations, but doing this in a way that replicates the housing practices of the past will result in more carbon emissions and further deepen the climate crisis. How do we resolve this dilemma? How do we both ensure that housing remains attainable for all as a human right, and at the same time that we limit as much as possible housing's own contribution to the climate crisis? The mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing has long been concerned and aware of the risks that the climate crisis is posing to the enjoyment of the right. In my most recent report, however, I consider housing's own carbon footprint and how it alters priorities in the realization of the right to housing. A review of existing data and estimates brings into view the terrible realization that through energy consumption and construction alone, housing accounts for at least 37% of global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. Housing additionally contributes to climate change through the increase in average per capita living space, the emission of pollutants, urban sprawl, deforestation, and soil seeding. Household waste alone is responsible for 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Directly linked to urban setup, transport accounts for around 23% of global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. The way we build our cities and organize our communities locks in for decades patterns of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions for decades, determined by the distance people are required to cross from their homes in order to reach their places of work, education, health, and services. These distances have been increasing as cities expand and sprawl, and the most vulnerable find themselves pushed farther and farther to the peripheries of cities, requiring long commutes. These are forms of spatial segregation and discrimination as they compel mostly ethnic and racial minorities, indigenous peoples, women, migrants, and others similarly vulnerable, a pattern that I have called attention to and strongly condemn in my reports on discrimination and spatial segregation to the UN General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council. In my report on climate change and the right to housing, I call for an overall, a transformation of how we think about housing, I call for urgent steps to be taken towards a just, human rights-based, climate-resilient, and carbon-neutral housing for all. Both science and accumulated experience shows that it is possible to reach net zero operational and embodied carbon emissions in buildings. Increased efforts are needed to achieve energy efficiency of buildings through retrofitting, through improving building standards, electrifying households with green energy where this is not yet the case, and promoting life cycle approach to buildings. At the same time, it is important that improvements in energy efficiency do not drive the cost of housing upwards. In other words, carbon neutral housing should not be a luxury that only the wealthy are able to afford. This is a function of technological innovation, equitable access to technology and finance, and effective and humane governance. When applied to the housing sector, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities of climate policies requires a careful prioritization between and within developed and in developing countries. In developing countries, the majority of mitigation potential is in new buildings. In developed countries, the majority of mitigation potential is in retrofitting existing buildings. But the more immediate and feasible task before us is in adaptation and not mitigation. I argue that countries have a responsibility to reconsider whether building new, more and larger housing is the right solution. They need rather to take stock of whether the existing built environment can be used, upgraded, or converted for the use of adequate housing. This would include restoring disused buildings where this can be done safely, renovating and retrofitting dated buildings, encouraging the transformation of secondary homes in main places of residence, and actively discouraging the financialization of housing, where housing is only seen as an investment object rather than a place to live in. When constructing new housing, this would entail promoting the use of affordable and accessible net zero embodied carbon for major building components, their land use footprint, as well as renewable materials such as wood, clay, straw, and recycled materials. It is important to invest in the development of new carbon neutral, climate resilient social housing that is affordable for all. Urban planning should be mindful of climate change, disaster risks, energy response, land use, transport, location of services, and infrastructure equity. Efforts should be directed particularly to making improvements as regards informal settlements and their residents. They remain among the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate shocks and most exposed to top-down and arbitrary decisions that lead to forced evictions and resettlement. Their right to adequate housing, starting with tenure security and the right to remain in their location, must be treated as legally binding commitments by government as they figure out how best to adapt to climate shocks. It is important not to leave anyone behind. Care should be taken to involve communities and groups at risk of marginalization into the planning, design, and implementation of activities aimed at post-disaster reconstruction, achieving climate resilience and climate adaptation. Resettlement and relocation should only be considered as a last resort when it is strictly necessitated due to the unsustainability of maintaining human settlements in at-risk zones. Moreover, any resettlement needs to be carefully planned with full consultation with and the participation of affected and receiving communities to avoid negative impacts and resulting human rights violations. Resettlement following risk assessments needs to be treated as a legal obligation, which has concrete commitments of process, compensation, land access, housing adequacy, participation, and consent. If a participatory and widely inclusive approach is not followed, then climate action and post-disaster reconstruction run the risk of worsening inequalities and deepening the vulnerabilities of already marginalized communities. Let me now offer a few remarks about the legal and human rights foundations of an approach to housing that takes climate justice seriously. In international human rights law, adequate housing is understood to comprise 7 criteria: security of tenure, availability of services, affordability, habitability, accessibility, appropriate location, and cultural adequacy. While all of these elements remain relevant in the context of the climate crisis, I have suggested that a new and 8th element, namely sustainability, has increasingly emerged as a core requirement. Last year, the UN Human Rights Council recognized the right to a clean and healthy environment. I am similarly of the view that it is time to recognize that the right to adequate housing should include an additional element, namely sustainability. Such recognition will be well-founded in international law. Housing should not be treated mindlessly in a manner that destroys the planet. To the contrary, states' obligation to realize the right to adequate housing should require both ensuring housing's resilience against climate events and reducing housing's own carbon footprint. We can no longer afford to pursue the objective of fulfilling the right to adequate housing with complete disregard for its impact on climate. On the contrary, we need to aim for housing that already exists to become carbon neutral and climate resilient, and for new housing to be conceived as such, planning already from the outset for housing's different life cycles. The obligation of states to take steps to the maximum of their available resources towards a progressive and full realization of the right to adequate housing for all under their treaty obligations encompasses also taking measures to prevent foreseeable harm by climate change, including on the rights of future generations. Indeed, as the recently issued Maastricht Principles on the Human Rights of Future Generations reminds us, this is a core legal obligation of states at the international level. Human rights rest on intergenerational justice, which has both individual and collective dimensions, as the Maastricht Principles remind us. It is possible in the foreseeable future to achieve a climate resilient and carbon neutral housing for all, which is critical for adaptation and perhaps a pillar of whatever mitigation is still possible. It is crucial that this transformation is achieved in a human rights compliant manner. In order to ensure this, my report includes several detailed recommendations addressed to states, local governments, businesses, architects, investors, and others. First, all relevant stakeholders must step up efforts to improve the energy efficiency of households, such as the adoption of energy efficiency standards. They should encourage the retrofitting of housing to reduce climate change-related emissions, promote the use of highly efficient and low emissions lighting, appliances, and equipment systems, and expand access to electricity produced in an environmentally friendly manner and other green sources of energy where households still depend on fossil forms of energy for heating, cooking, and other needs. Second, they should encourage greater need for housing from the existing housing stock. This could also mean to restore disused buildings as living spaces, to renovate dated buildings, and ensure that vacant and secondary homes be used as main places of residence, for example, through appropriate taxation policies. In Latin America, much of this can be pursued through more effective implementation of a principle recognizing the constitutions of many states, such as Brazil or Mexico, that property has a social function. In housing construction, the use of affordable and accessible net zero embodied carbon for major building components should be promoted, as well as renewable materials such as wood, clay, straw, or recycled materials. Investments should be made in the development of new carbon neutral, climate resilient social housing that is affordable for all. Urban planning policy should integrate climate change, disaster risk reduction, energy response, land use, transport, locational services, and infrastructure equity, as I mentioned. In such efforts, in particular, any informal settlements in the residents should be included. Participatory and more democratic urban planning is the only legitimate and effective way to deal with the consequences of climate impacts. It is crucial to ensure that efforts to curb carbon emissions in the built environment and the housing sector do not drive up housing and energy costs for households, further expand the global deficit of adequate and affordable housing, or increase existing vulnerabilities and marginalization of the poor, women, indigenous people, migrants, and others. Measures to ensure the affordability of housing in the just transition may include providing targeted financial support, including to low-income households and those living in informal housing, and splitting the costs of the green transition in the housing sector fairly between public authorities, taxpayers, homeowners, and tenants, or other affected interest groups. I called on the international community to create a simplified, efficient mechanism for the provision of international financial assistance for mitigation adaptation interventions in the housing sector for developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. It is, in my view, essential that the recently established Loss and Damage Fund in COP27 becomes resource and operational as quickly as possible, is dispersed efficiently, includes mechanisms of public control and for participation of civil society actors, and ensures that support actually goes to those whose homes have been damaged or have become uninhabitable due to climate-related impacts. I also suggested to create an international mechanism for obtaining redress and compensation for climate-induced impacts on housing from those most responsible for causing the climate crisis, including those in the global north and privileged sections of the global south. In my view, it is important to establish the historic responsibilities of states and private equity and real estate finance entities stemming from encouraging overbuilding and ensure that they participate in any redress and compensation mechanism proportionately, according to their level of contribution to the climate crisis. Finally, I suggested to allow for the suspension or cancellation of debt payments in the aftermath of extreme climate events so that governments can ensure climate efficient and resilient reconstruction for those whose homes have been damaged or destroyed. Climate impacts illustrate the vast social and economic divisions and political powerlessness that pervade our countries today. It is my sincere hope that Latin America and Caribbean can show that a better world is possible. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, señor.